my name is DeCloss. I'm the founder and CTO of PlexTrack, longtime pen tester. I had my specialty in application security. Started PlexTrack as a side project because I hated writing reports, hated spending a lot of time creating a 300-page PDF and then delivering it and feeling like nobody was doing anything with it. And then coming back a year later and basically rewriting the same report, right? So that was really the impetus for PlexTrack, but it has a lot to do with what I want to talk about today, and that's just the role of pen testing in the continuous validation lifecycle. And so what is the notion and how do these things marry when you have a robust pen testing lifecycle, or maybe not, and what role pen testing can play within continuous validation and how they really are complementary to each other. So, I mean, just a brief poll. How many in the room are pen testers? Okay, great. So you write reports, you deliver reports. How about like GRC, where kind of like a little bit different focus, but you still like are delivering reports, but you may also be receiving and managing the results of some pen test reports. Anybody? No? How about like SOC, ops, security engineering, maybe threat intel or IR? Okay, great. So you'll probably still deliver reports in some fashion, but you also receive a lot, especially from the pen test side, right? And then any security leaders? Okay, anyone that didn't follow those categories? Okay, great. Okay, yeah, no problem. Good. So it kind of gives a good gauge of like, hey, these are all the roles that exist, kind of at a high level within the security paradigm, right? Security engineering and security teams at large. And so, like the theme of today's talk is really, hey, what happens after you deliver that first report? And how does this become a continuous life cycle when we talk about pen testing and where it fits within the notion of continuous validation? And basically the idea that delivering the report is not the end of the road, right? And that there's still a lot more work that happens post delivery of the report. It may not be by you, but definitely you have a role to play if you're the one delivering the report. And if you're the one receiving the report, this is where your work actually starts, right? And then how does it fit in with the rest of the daily tasks that you have on a regular basis, right? So how does this fit into the paradigm of trying to get better from an overall security posture? And I always like to kind of like, I think definitely those that are pen testers will, relate to this. I always kind of like to have this graphic up from time to time. It definitely reminds me of the days when I was doing pen testing where, there's always a life cycle for everything, right? There's always this ups and downs, and you feel like you're making great progress and then moving 4 steps back. And this is just kind of the weekly life of a pen tester, right? And then you're trying to figure out how to get things working in the environment, or exploits working, and you just can't find anything. And time seems to be on your worst enemy in terms of you're running out of it to try and find something. Considering a career change as a life goal, and then you start to find something, right? And then this is really intriguing, and you get a little bit deeper, and you're like, hey, I might have something here. And then you're like, I do have something here. I'm on top of the world. You get that, that high of like exploitation in some fashion. You do all the screenshotting, and then you're like, man, I need more time, right? And this was my life. Definitely, my specialty was in web apps. And you spend, like, especially on a weekly engagement, you spend like, most of the week kind of getting used to the app, right? So if there's not any low-hanging fruit, come Friday afternoon, you're so used to like how the app is operating, is when I would find a lot of the exploits, right? Because it's like you finally start to find the intricacies and things like that. So, and then you got to go, and now you got to write up everything, and you got to deliver that report, right? And so everybody hates reporting for the most part. We all love hacking, but this isn't the end, right? We have to do something with this report. So don't have to raise your hands on this one. But I'm curious. I want you to reflect on when you deliver the report, what happens after that, right? And maybe answer yes, no, or maybe in your head with whether you're a consulting firm and you're delivering this on behalf of your clients, or when you're an internal security team and you're delivering reports within your organization, or you're actually the ones that are receiving these reports. What happens? Like, so you've received that first pen test report, or it's the initial report from the engagement that you you contract it out or whatever, and do tickets in some fashion, get created and assigned to for all the issues that were reported, right? I think it's like priority number one. Does everything that got reported get tracked? Get assigned and tracked somewhere, right? Does something get created, and in what system do those tickets get created? I know that in my life or as a pen tester, definitely this tended to be spreadsheets, and it tended to be like we're copying stuff out of a PDF of just the highs or the criticals or the ones that I found most interesting. And then let's say I leave the organization, and the people that picked that up next didn't remember to go back and look, were there other issues that maybe we should bring in? So I think that's an important thing. Just like, do you do this? Yes, no, maybe, right? Do all the risks that get reported, do they get categorized and prioritized against all the other existing issues in the environment? Because the pen test is an important engagement. It identifies a lot of risks, but it's not the only source of risks in your environment. You're doing like your customers or your enterprise, they're doing some tweaking back here. They're doing lots of different activities in terms of scanning, in terms of other types of assessments, risk assessments. So do the issues coming out of the pen test actually get prioritized and categorized alongside all of the other things that are happening, right? So yes, just yes, no, maybe as you kind of contemplate this. Do the remediation activities, so let's say you are getting these into something and you're starting to identify who's responsible for these, and are we making progress? Do they get reported on a routine basis in terms of like, hey, are we making progress? Are we getting better? And how does that reporting look, right? So this is not the pen test report. This is actually the metrics related to the activities that go behind fixing the issues, right? And then once these issues are fixed, are they submitted for remediation validation, right? So I think a lot of us, like if we're consulting firms as pen testers, you always tend to build in, or at least most people do, build in the validation portion of the engagement after the assessment. So typically it'd be like, hey, within 60 to 90 days, we'll come back and validate anything that we found that you might have you feel you might have fixed since we delivered the report. So how did those items get truly validated, once they're delivered? And if they are validated, do they continue to be tested again, right? Do they resurface, or are you reviewing them on an ongoing basis to make sure they're not happening again, right? In the software development world, we would call this regression testing, right? Did something regress with something that we just did? And then and then how often does this happen? Yes, no, maybe in your organization, pretty much nothing once you receive the report. We've checked the box. We've done our annual pen test. We're good to go from a compliance perspective, right? So, and I say this because this is what I've lived in all various forms, right? And then at FlexTrack, we obviously see a lot of customers in the same boat, right? In various forms of this maturity life cycle, whether they're an enterprise or a consulting firm, we all face the same scenarios, right? And by the way, when you deliver a pen test report, I mentioned it before, there's all kinds of other things that the security team is dealing with, right? And I like to call this kind of blue team overload. I think those of us that have been in security for a long time, remember when this would have looked much, much smaller, right? And this is only just ballooned in terms of how many companies are out there for all different types of solutions, right? All different types of activities that go on within a security program, right? And so these are the things that the blue team is also having to kind of keep an eye on and manage. It's not that they have all of these tools, but they're definitely being probed by all kinds of vendors. Hey, you need a solution for this. You need a solution for that. And it continues to add more noise if you're not careful, right? And may not actually do what they're supposed to be doing, because if you think about that, the average security team is going to be rather small and limited in time and resources. So I think it's just good to kind of keep a perspective of like what our industry is facing as a whole, right? These are all this is actually like probably most of the companies that exist in cyber, but definitely not all, right? So it's just an interesting perspective as we talk about delivering pen test results and how do we fit that into the continuous life cycle. So I always like to come back to this graph as well to not forget why we're here, right? For organizations, we want to prevent the right side of this activity happening as much as possible in various forms, right? Not just once, but in multiple ways, right? So the goal of a pen test and security assessment is to try and identify, like, hey, where does the organization have gaps in this life cycle? And are they able to detect activities as early in this life cycle as possible? And what are their response capabilities if they do detect it, especially when we get over to the exfiltration phase? Obviously, the further right the attacker gets, the bigger the business impact, right? And again, this is not just a one-time thing. This is across all different aspects of the organization. So testing occurs in lots of different areas within the organization. But this is really why we're here, is to prevent compromise and to detect compromise as early as possible, right? So that when the attackers do get identified or detected, hopefully, that you're actually able to put controls in place to mitigate the impact, right, that happens. So really the right questions that we always should be asking is, how do adversaries breach our environment? Which tactics, techniques, and procedures are effective? Which tactics, techniques, and procedures are we emulating with our environment? And then, how quickly can we detect and stop them? Which areas do we have the biggest gaps? Where are we the weakest? And then where do we also have the strongest? And this is all leading to the notion of what continuous validation truly is. It's trying to answer those questions on a continuous basis for your organization or for your customers, right? So like if you are a pen test service provider, you may actually be able to breach break into the service offering of continuous validation for your customers, right? So, but like really, what does continuous validation mean? It's definitely a proactive assessment paradigm where you're going to be receiving intelligence or receiving insights from different tools and threat actors and intelligence feeds to be able to identify, what should we be testing for, right? Because we always want to at least be testing for the things that we know about in the industry, right? And it's meant to be a proactive approach so that you're not sitting here waiting for that bad thing to happen, and maybe you've got some detections in place, but can you actually test how quickly you would detect these things? It's also meant to determine the efficacy of your security controls and the policies around them, right? So if you purchased one of those, hundreds of tools on that previous slide, are they configured correctly and are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? This is an important piece of continuous validation. And then ultimately, how good are you at detecting this attack behavior, adapting to new and emerging threats, mitigating business impact of the attacks? Are you able to measure your risk and your progress of reducing the risk over time? And this is a continuous life cycle, right? So it's all meant to be as automated as possible. Have the capabilities to be able to really show the progress over time and collect the right data and the right metrics that empower your security team and empower your leaders to know that they're getting a return on their investment. So where does pen testing fit into that? Well, if you think back to the goals of continuous validation, the goals are to proactively identify vulnerabilities and exploitable conditions in your environment, detect and respond to threats, be able to emulate threats as a pen testing team, obviously ensure compliance, that we're on the right track in terms of meeting our obligations from a regulatory perspective, being able to adapt to new and emerging risks. And I think this is a really important one. As things come out more instantly, how quickly are we able, have we exercised the muscle to be able to test for these things in a continuous basis, right? Or is it a kind of all hands on deck type of moment, right? When I come back to the notion of Log4j. When Log4j came out, was that like, oh, okay, well, we'll just throw this into our continuous validation testing life cycle, be able to go test for it. And yeah, it may add a few extra hours to our week, but we're used to doing this. Or was it kind of like an all hands on deck? How do we identify, where we have gaps, right? And it's truly positive validation of remediation, right? So, and we're going to talk about what it means to be in the last mile of continuous validation, but it's true positive validation that the items have been fixed. So when we talk about tools that offer continuous validation, they're doing scanning or doing some automated exploitation or something to identify the risks. And typically what they do is they'll just rescan those systems again. And if the issue isn't there, they presume that it's done, that it's fixed, right? And I always argue, and I think most pen testers would too, that just the absence of information does not mean that the issue is resolved, right? It just means that that technique may have failed, or that the system was offline. There could be a number of conditions for the scanning and the automation aspect to say that it's validated when it's not actually. And this is why pen testers build in the validation phase within their assessments, is that we go back and we say like, hey, you said you fixed this. Cross-site scripting is a great example. I mean, I know that's kind of, it's becoming less and less of an issue with just modern protection mechanisms, but back in the day, you'd get a list of, hey, all these endpoints are vulnerable to cross-site scripting. They'd go and try and remediate it one way, and then you just bypass it again in another way, right? So that's what we truly mean by positive validation of the remediation activities. And then obviously overall, we're enhancing the security posture. So these are the goals of continuous validation, and pen testing fits directly into this life cycle as well. So we really have an opportunity to talk through the pen testing phase. Actually kind of fits into that last mile of the continuous validation as well. You have the ability to go back and test these things on a regular basis, right? In building out automated test plans, bringing in intelligence on a regular basis as new exploits come out, and those go into the continuous validation lifecycle. And you have automation around your pen testing lifecycle as well, that then you can actually merge these together. This allows you to prioritize which issues are coming out, getting them resolved, truly validating resolution, reporting effectively on the remediation activities. And we'll talk about the metrics and reporting around this in a second, but the most important thing that really comes down to testing the last mile is have issues resurfaced, right? As not only are we trying to test for new things and test for new tactics and techniques, but do the ones that we've already tested in the past still work, right? Are we still seeing that the controls are in place and nothing that has changed, configuration hasn't changed, that we're getting better, right? Or staying the same, like, hey, we did validate that this is fixed. Are we able to continually show that it hasn't resurfaced? So when we merge these, it's the life cycles you obviously see are very similar. We can merge these together in terms of reporting, tracking, prioritizing, validating the fixes, and should we actually close the issue or not? And I think that's a big question. Like when we talk about just within the pen testing life cycle, most people won't close a finding until it's actually been validated that the fix actually works. And that's an important piece of every life cycle when we talk about the proactive assessment piece. Is like, hey, we identified something, it's fixed, but we need to validate that. And then obviously having metrics for each stage within the life cycle. So are we able to show answers to the right questions that the security leadership wants to know, as well as being able to automate as much of that process as possible? Because the more we can automate, the more we can test on a regular basis, and bring all of the issues and the progress to light for the organization. So just kind of in summary, before we start talking about metrics, is that we can supercharge both continuous validation life cycles and processes with pen testing activities and vice versa. We can augment our continuous validation with other pen testing activities like pen test as a service, breach and attack simulation, purple teaming, tabletops. All of these produce results that can go into that life cycle on a continuous basis. And then we can also augment the pen testing activities with continuous validation. For example, how do we get these into the right systems for tracking and remediation? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it Jira? Is it ServiceNow? Is it some other ticketing system? Are there items that need to just funnel straight into the CI/CD pipeline? This is how we can also automate a lot of the results coming out of a pen test. And these are principles that come from the from the continuous validation process as well. And then I kind of continue to reemphasize, like, if you have repeat offenders in terms of vulnerabilities, how are you truly showing that they're getting eliminated, right? So it's very common to have the same issue pop up time and time again. And if you have visibility across all of your testing activities, including all of the automation scanning and things like that, you really do have an idea of, like, where are we actually fixing things and where do we actually just say that we're fixing them, but they continue to pop up. So something in that life cycle is broken. So that leads us to how do we measure this, right? What the adage is, like, what gets measured gets done. And so every stage of the continuous validation life cycle merged with the pen testing life cycle should have metrics around it, right? And so are we prioritizing the progress that's being made on the issues that have been reported? Risk-based vulnerability, viewing this from a risk-based lens. I tend to get on a soapbox when we talk about how we prioritize issues, because every scanner, every pen test, every tester is going to provide their own view of how severe this issue is that they've reported, but it always has to come back to the context of the business, right, and the context of the organization that's being tested. And so that's what we mean by contextual scoring. Are we providing a mechanism within the context of our organization to show priorities, right? To show which ones we should be getting fixed sooner than later. And these may be different than what the pen tester actually says or what the automation tool actually says. And so making sure that we're having an emphasis on this has the context of our environment applied to it. Are we making sure that we have full coverage within our organization, or at least making progress towards coverage, right? I think that we all know that the first CIS control is all around inventory and assets, and do you know what you're trying to protect? And I think it's still one of the hardest, like, if not the hardest things to do ever. And the opportunities are just endless for new systems and new areas of attack surface to break in. And that's like why we have a whole category now around attack surface management, right, and exposure management. But are we at least able to show, like, hey, we know this. These are the techniques that we're using to identify where we might have coverage gaps, right? So are we testing for these coverage gaps? And then, with the adage of kind of always be discovering. And then obviously tracking remediation activities is super important. And I think that, like, solid trends regarding your remediation activities come down to SLAs. Do we have timeframes associated with how quickly we're supposed to be resolving critical issues versus high issues versus medium issues and low? And are we making progress in adhering to these SLAs? And does it also identify where there might be other gaps in terms of our remediation life cycle? So if we start to see that we have a set of medium vulnerabilities that continually fall outside of the SLA, that informs decision making. Like, okay, is this a team that's having issues? Is this a set of technology that continues to have issues? Is it the way that we're trying to configure the result, the fix and the remediation actually not working? So those SLAs and the trends really start to become valuable data for us on how we can actually measure progress. And so that concludes with, everything should be trended over time. All of the metrics that we report are showing, hey, we're doing, this is what we've done in the past, and this is what we're doing now, and here's what we plan to do in the future. So these are all the metrics kind of related to the continuous validation life cycle, and how pen testing, you can just see, flows straight into these as a source, as well as an augment of the validation life cycle. So, I'm going to kind of run into, like, some examples of what we mean by how we're reporting on this in a continuous fashion. And I always like to highlight that the notion of, like, is not are we secure, but are we getting better, right? And you really can only answer that question comparing yourself to yourself, right? you may have some analytics based on other people's progress, but that doesn't mean a whole lot, right? Because you're actually testing your environment. So the key questions that everybody's going to want to answer is like, what are we working on now? Like, what's in process? What's in flight from a testing perspective? What are we trying to validate on a regular basis? Are we working on the right things? Do we have everything prioritized correctly from a remediation perspective, from a test plan perspective? Have we identified the right sources of things to be looking at so that we know that we're continuing to work on the right things? And then we build out our roadmap, right, from a security perspective, like what should we be working on next? What are the key priorities, right? And then are we making progress? I think that's the big one, right? That's the how do we show that we're making progress? So these are just some examples of some ideas of things that we work on and how we prioritize items. But you can see, we break it down into like a living risk register where you actually have some visibility as to, hey, are we making progress in these areas of risk and what findings are associated with them? So any findings and vulnerabilities that get reported from any source are being brought into a higher level category of risk, and we can show that these were prioritized in this order, and here's the progress that's being made. So it actually highlights what are the key things that are being worked on, right now. And then how do we know that we're working on the right things? And this comes back to that contextual scoring. So you can see here, we've got some examples of where you might have a severity tied to a contextual score, right? And this can be your own algorithm for scoring. In fact, we encourage it. There's obviously some defaults that make sense, but within your environment, you may actually have, priorities around findings that come from certain areas within your organization need a higher priority. For example, if you're a PCI, if you have to be compliant with PCI, anything that's within the CDE or the cardholder data environment is going to have a higher priority if findings are related to that than not, because that affects your compliance. It affects how you might get breached with respect to PCI. So you might have a different score for those types of findings and risks as opposed to ones that are coming from within a lab environment or something like that. So being able to provide some sort of independent scoring mechanism that you have input into is really important. And we'll continue to harp on this because every vendor and every pen tester may provide their own assumption of how severe some of these issues are. But if you haven't actually gone in and applied your business context, you might be working on the wrong things, right? So then, obviously that plays into like, what should we be working on next? This is definitely a more proactive paradigm within cybersecurity, taking threat intelligence and not just applying that threat intelligence to defensive mechanisms like applying the IOCs in the configurations of your security control devices, but also, are you able to build out test plans for your security testing team to actually go and say like, hey, we want to continue to test these new and emerging threats that we're getting from our intelligence feeds. From the service provider side, this is also an opportunity to offer more continuous services, right? We can have a threat-informed pen testing paradigm that we offer our customers or that we offer our business, right? And so this allows us to show like, here's the things that we're going to be working on next. We know we have gaps in these areas. Here's what we've resolved. Here's what's coming down the pike, and as new threats emerge, this may change. So I like to draw the analog here between anything like a product roadmap. If you're a software development shop, right, you're gonna have a lot of things that you need to build into a product. You have to prioritize them somehow. It's not any different than with this notion of prioritizing your risks for security. And then, like, how do you show that we're making progress? We talk about coverage, right? Are we testing across different areas within the organization or different areas within the attack lifecycle? And can we show that we're getting better in certain areas? And every test we can kind of highlight, here was the coverage of this test. And then as you continue to do more testing, it shows the different overlays of the different coverages that you're having, right? And then you can also start to see like, hey, from a red and a blue team perspective, what was successful, what was not, right? So we draw the parallel of purple teaming in this slide here, but like you can also show like, hey, the miter heat map. Like people love this visual, right? This is older. This is an older view of it, but like, because it's much busier even today. But you can start to show like, hey, we've tested things in these categories, and they've been successful. And you can start to adapt how you're informing your test plans through a notion like this of like just being able to show, hey, we're making progress on the test coverage, as well as which issues or which TTPs are actually working well versus not, and then that starts to inform where you should focus your remediation and your validation activities, right? And then everything kind of starts to boil into a burn down chart, right? Are we able to burn down the issues that are getting identified? Are we able to show over time that as these things come in, we're fixing them and we're actually making progress on getting issues resolved and prioritizing our risks from a remediation perspective? And again, this is just a different view of the SLA notion of being able to say like, hey, we've got over time, we kind of average, we stay on track in terms of averaging our mean time to close for an issue that gets reported, and being able to identify the key areas where we might have issues that keep resurfacing. So to kind of start landing the plane here, merging the notion of your pen testing program and the continuous validation lifecycle really does accelerate the success of your overall security program and the security program of your customers, right? And this is a new way of thought for a lot of us, right? It's not just a one and done pen test every year just to do some high level validation. It can be very specific on a regular basis, and that's the whole goal, is that things are changing all the time, and so we have this continuous paradigm that marries both of these activities, and it allows you to stay somewhat ahead of the curve as new threats emerge. It allows you to focus on proactive activities like threat modeling, and then truly validating that the fixes that people have put into place are actually resolved and continue to stay in that state. And if you have this continuous mindset, if something does pop up, you know about it, right? In terms of resurface, you know about it right away. So the key takeaways for today is that you want to have a programmatic approach to your pen testing activities, merging that with your continuous validation mindset, being able to do this on a proactive and programmatic way. By marrying the reactive and the proactive, you actually have fantastic metrics of being able to show true progress in your security posture. We report these things as trends. We should always focus on identifying and filling the gaps based on the trends that we're seeing, and the data paints the best story. And it takes discipline and focus. This is not an easy endeavor. These are the activities that we tend to not really like because we like to do the hacking. We like to do the more technical work, and a lot of this is truly just program management. But it's important because it is hard, right? It's not hard just because it's hard. It's hard because it's important. And I think we could all do hard things, and that's what we should always be focused on.